Today we have gathered here for a dialogue on unlocking the potential of India's female workforce for the future of work as a part of our project Good and Better Jobs in India. The project looks into strengthening the discourse on inclusive economic growth by analyzing the existing channels of workers' welfare. India's pursuit for gender equality in the evolving labor market is crucial for economic growth as well as social development. Despite various government and corporate initiatives to enhance workforce participation for women, significant gender disparities still persist, with women disproportionately represented in low paying informal sectors and facing barriers in formal employment. This calls for further action in order to address safety, flexibility, and social security for women to create an inclusive and equitable workforce. Now, I would take some moment to introduce you all to our speakers and provide a brief agenda for today's webinar. We'll start with a short introduction by Ms. Sanchita Chatterjee, Fellow at CUTS, which will be followed by the panel discussion. We will start with session 1, for which the theme is Enhancing Women's Participation in the India's Formal Economy. In this panel, we will have Paulami Bhattacharya, Women Entrepreneurship Program Lead from NASCOM Foundation, Abhishek Singh, Team Lead from Prosperity, and Aishani Rai, Senior Associate from Aapti Institute as our speakers, along with Dr. Aruna Sharma, former Secretary to the Ministry of Steel and Distinguished Fellow at CUTS as the moderator. The session will be followed by a short question and answer session. Then we'll move to the second session with the theme Fostering Women's Safety and Skill Sets in India's Informal Sector. This panel will be moderated by Shri Dida Singh, former Secretary to the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs and Distinguished Fellow at CUTS. The panel will include Mukti Arora, Technical Consultant from UN Women, Yamini Atmavilas, Director of Gender and Equity from DASRA, and Dania MB, Fellow from Vivagiri National Labour Institute as our speakers. Coming to certain house announcements, each panelist will be allotted 8 minutes for presenting their views on the question posed to them by the moderator. After our panelists have put forward their views, the floor will be opened to all the participants for a discussion. We also request all the participants, especially the panelists and the presenters, to please keep their videos on so that the discussion becomes much more engaging. We also request only the person who speaks to please turn on his or her microphone, and other participants are requested to put their microphone off to avoid any inconvenience. Lastly, participants having questions are requested to either ask the same over the chat box or use the raise hand option present in Zoom. Now, I would request Sanchita ma'am to please take the discussion forward. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Tasmita. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a great pleasure for me and also a great honor to speak ahead of our esteemed panelists who are going to make interventions on this very important topic of unlocking the power of female workforce for the betterment of Indian economy. I'm just going to set the context. As Tasmita explained, this webinar is being held as part of a project. The project is being implemented in 2 phases. We are almost at the fag end of the second phase of the project, and the project began in 2018. One of the aims of the project, or basic aim of the project, is to build a narrative on alternative models of economic growth that focuses on inclusivity, on sustainability. And the underlying theme is that increased social protection of workers through different welfare schemes is good for the economy, good for the employers. And as part of this project, we have conducted several studies, though we haven't really focused on gender in any of the studies. Gender inevitably comes up, when you're looking at labor market. And there are 2-3 very interesting points, and I'll not take too much time. So one of the things is, lately we have undertaken a lot of studies on gig economy, or digital platform-based economy, and we looked at gig workers. And, our in-house survey teams didn't get much success in interviewing many female gig workers. One of the things we found is that it's very gendered, first of all. A lot of gig workers, female gig workers, are in, say, the job of beautician in urban clap. Whereas when they try to find taxi drivers or delivery personnel, they didn't find many women gig workers. And this experience in India is a contrast to many other developing countries. I mean, you go to Southeast Asia, you'll see many more women. So the question is why? Because gig work also offers flexibility, which is suitable for women generally. And secondly, our survey team for this project and then another project also had this experience when they tried to talk to some female workers. They were prevented from talking to them. Those women were asked not to talk to our team. And it's not just in Grow Jobs project, we had this in another project as well. So, you don't, first of all, you don't find many female workers and then you don't get to hear their voices. So, what is happening? I don't know whether this is a gender thing or something else. And third thing, we also interviewed some big companies, global level gig economy companies, and they have said that they have, some of them have said that they have strategies and policies in place for engaging more women workers, making lives of the women workers more comfortable. So on one hand, they have these like really progressive policies. On the other hand, this is the experience we had. So I just wanted to, put this out there, and I'm really, really eager to hear our two panels. And I would like to invite Mrs. Aruna Sharma to take over and moderate the first session, which will be on enhancing women's participation in India's formal economy. Thank you, ma'am.
Right. Thank you so much. So what I'll do is I'll make very short opening remarks, and then I'll ask the panelists to elaborate when we are going ahead on this. So if you look at it, I'm very happy that you have chosen this particular topic while we are moving ahead with it. And when you are looking at the women workforce, which is coming, and the various barriers they are facing in either entering the workforce or progressing in the workforce or continuing in the workforce, I'll put it into three jackets. One jacket is the white collar jobs. So white collar jobs, like you rightly said, there are policies, there is a consciousness in the management to provide conducive environment so that more and more women participate into the work and progress along with it. And then other is a labor force, where by the sheer need of income levels to enhance, lots of women are in the labor workforce. And third is the self-employed kinds, and which could be even unpaid worker into the self-farm or a family business. So that kind of a thing which is not recognized, as well as where in either through SHGs or maybe a small shop or through dairy business, they are self-employing themselves and earning their incomes. So when you look at it, one is the sheer economic need of survival, and one is a career progression on which they are working in. Now, I'll put it this way, the moment they enter the workforce, the differentiation has to end. You cannot distinguish, and I'm very happy you did not flag gender angle, but it came automatically, because once they enter the workforce, it's a question of equity as far as the delivery is concerned. The delivery of whatever is expected from the goods or from the quality of services or the quality of inputs, there cannot be a differentiation just because they are a women folks. But having said that, it's equally important that there are some special needs, like what you take care of the maternity child care leave or the creche arrangements or for ensuring that. So in that, the construction labor is pretty well organized. You have a collection which comes from the contractor, and that money is given as a compensation of wages for 6 months to a woman worker when she delivers a child. So this is something very, very well organized in an unorganized sector of construction laborers. But when you look at it in the other places where there is a definite salaried job, they get the salary. But then there is a huge section where there is no such protection. So that is something which has to be done, that on one hand, we talk of equity of performance. On other hand, the special needs of the women has to be taken care of when they are moving ahead. I'm very happy you mentioned about the gig worker while you're talking about this, because that gives them flexibility, but that also adds to the uncertainty of the work. And definitely there is no progress. They continue to do the same work day in and day out and throughout their life. There is no progression unless until they acquire extra skills. That skilling is not yet inbuilt into any of these sectors where they can enhance their skills and climb the ladder into the performance. So even though they may be beautician, maybe tomorrow they become at the next level of whatever stage they can go into it. And you will be amazed to know that the kind of protections which are coming into different sectors today, you did send me a suggestive question for the Ministry of Steel. I was very happy to see women engineers in the shop floors. So it is not that the women are looking for a comfortable job sitting in the air-conditioned things for monitoring or doing in the IT sector. They are very much on the shop floor of the blast furnace, facing the heat of melted steel. And they are doing very, very well. And I'm really proud to say that in this sector, the women reached the highest position. We had a sales CMD. Of course, I was there, and we had two very, very efficient joint secretaries and additional chief secretaries. So in the sense, it became a sector where the women did deliver on par, equity basis, and climb the ladders on their own merits. So in the organized sector, that is the model which has to go. In self-employed sector, the skilling has to join the hands with them when they are progressing ahead. And in the other sectors, which is neither self-employed for this, but on the blue-collar job or unorganized sector, what we call it, what is needed, like in the construction labors, to have the arrangement so that their rights as being a woman are taken care of. So having making these opening remarks, I will like to go to the panelist speakers. So I think I'll start off with Abhishek Singh. And Abhishek, I will like you to focus what kind of a discrimination you observe in the workforce between women and men in the formal economies when we are going ahead. And what kind of an organizational policies are there to ensure this discrimination is negated, or even the legal positions from it? And maybe you can also give some examples when we are moving ahead with it, and which are the policies that have worked and which are the policies that need more tweaking, or which are the policies which has to be thrown in the dustbin and to be rewritten when we are going ahead. So over to you, Abhishek. You have 8 minutes with you.
First of all, thank you so much for having me here. I'm very grateful for having the time to speak, share my limited experience with the rest of the panel. And I am looking forward to hearing other people's views on this as well. I'm a young person. I would like to learn more about this, but I will gladly share my limited opinion on this. As far as the question of ensuring more entry, a greater entry of women workers in the formal economy is concerned, the first thing that we need to do is to break down the problem in its constituent parts. Really, the problem that we're trying to solve is a set of two problems. First, not enough women are entering the workforce in the first place. And then when women enter, they tend to have informal employment, as ma'am just suggested. Now, statistically speaking, the first problem is obviously a larger one. Only 37% of women who are of working age are currently employed in the workforce, as opposed to 78% of male workers who are working age men in India. So there's clearly an issue of enough women entering the workforce. But even when we consider the number of women who have already entered and their status in employment, we find out some very interesting patterns. So if you look at the most recent periodic labor force survey, for example, in rural areas, women actually, and you look at the most basic indicator of formality, which is whether or not workers have a formal job contract that lists out basic conditions of employment, whether it be working hours or wages, women in rural areas actually perform better than men. So for example, 35% of men have a formal job contracts in rural areas, but 47% of women do. In urban areas, the figures reverse slightly, but the gap is very low. 42% of women have formal job contracts and 46% of men. So this general belief that we often operate under, that women tend to always have informal employment, is in some ways of belief that needs to be further substantiated with some nuance here. And one thing, when we first see these figures, it's sometimes confusing, but when we take into account recent research, the picture becomes a little clearer. So in 2023, Professors Kanika Mahajan and Purvali Chakrabarti at the Ashoka University basically conducted research trying to understand the size of the firms in which women tend to be employed. And one finding which they had was that larger firms women workers tend to be overrepresented in larger firms and underrepresented in shorter firms. To rephrase this finding in ways that would be helpful for us to draft a basic problem statement that we didn't try to solve, employers in larger firms are more likely to hire women in smaller firms. Now we have a problem statement that we can work with. Essentially, employers in smaller firms are unwilling or unable to hire women in important positions, and there's a number of reasons for that, right? And this, by the way, addresses both issues, whether or not it be the issue of not enough women entering the workforce in the first place, or when they enter, whether or not the employers are able to give women workers formal employment, right? One obvious reason, as ma'am mentioned, is differences in skill. Just to give you one example, women tend to be underrepresented in technical institutions for a number of structural reasons, where women are not able to enter the technical institutions in the first place. And for those issues, reforms in education policies would be the most appropriate solution to ensure that we are able to tackle the structural difficulties. But another underappreciated factor here, often in public discussions about informality and women labor, is that our laws that are applicable on workers today simply make it much costlier and much riskier for employers to hire women than male workers. And this is an area where when we start to understand what are these regulations that are creating this problem in the first place, that we understand the reasons for the informality. Now, I'll try to give you a couple of examples here. First would relate to regulations that affect women's working hours. So for example, when you're working in a factory, as an employer, if you have a male worker and you want to change their shift midweek, if you, for say on a Tuesday, you want to employ them in the day shift, but on Thursday, you want to employ them in the night shift, you are able to do so. But for women workers, you can't do that because there's a legal prohibition on the employer changing the shifts of the workers midweek. This essentially makes the employee less fungible than a woman worker, less fungible in terms of shift assignment than a male worker, therefore making it more difficult for an employer to hire hire women workers for longer term and therefore give them formal employment. Another much bigger issue is the issue of employing women at night. When you see the kinds of conditions that are applicable on women on employers when they are to employ women at night, some of them defy reason. Now, some of them are absolutely necessary. For example, the issue of transportation to ensure that women are able to reach safely from their workplace to their home. That is absolutely essential. But some of the other practical requirements become a practical obstacle. So, for example, some states will say, for example, Punjab will say that women workers can only be hired at night in a batch not less than 10 women workers and should constitute 2/3 of the total workforce in the night shift. The problem is women are already underrepresented in manufacturing. And so most employers can't meet that practical requirement in the first place, therefore resulting in a situation where formally women cannot be employed at night. Employers respond to this by either not employing women at all, or when they employ women, they're simply kept off the books. So the entirety of the night shift, or in case the work at night is extending as overtime of a formal shift in the daytime, those last 4 hours are essentially rendered informal for women workers. Therefore, no scrutiny regarding wages that are actually paid, including overtime pages that may be payable, or no scrutiny for women workers regarding the amount of security measures that should be provided to them. So this is a problem that regulations are creating. There's also a number of regulations that restrict the ability for women to access certain jobs, right? So these are broadly 2 kinds of restrictions that I can cite as examples. Firstly, a number of operations are identified as dangerous by each state government under the Factories Act. After they're identified as dangerous, the state government has the power to prohibit women from participating in those processes. Every state government has used this power to prohibit women from a number of jobs. A lot of processes in which the risk to women workers, as per scientific literature, is no higher than the risk to male workers. The result of that is that women are either entirely pushed out of industries that would be beneficial for them, or are kept informal in industries where they're nevertheless performing well. So to cite an example of the former one, semiconductor manufacturing is an emerging sector that many states give a lot of incentives to encourage job creation, and also because it's a strategic sector. But semiconductor manufacturing always involves electroplating. And electroplating is a process that women across states are simply not allowed to do. Now, because it's a high-paying job and it's a part of electronics manufacturing, women are simply kept out of electronics manufacturing. And evidence from other countries suggests that this is a very bad idea. So, for example, Malaysia is a major contributor to global markets for electronics manufacturing. And one thing that we see as early as 1990 was that even though women workers only made up 40% of the workforce in Malaysia in 1990, if you considered only the electronics manufacturing sector, women made up 80%. And in Malaysia, women were allowed to work at night and were allowed to work in electronics manufacturing despite any perceived dangers. Even though scientific literature indicates that there is no special risks to women. Just to give another example regarding issues where women workers are simply informalized, even though they're participating. Consider the carpet manufacturing industry in Uttar Pradesh. Everybody knows it's a legacy industry there. Women workers are highly represented in the carpet manufacturing industry. But if you see the firm sizes in which women are employed, you'll see that women are mostly employed in firms from 0 to 20 workers, and in larger firms, men are highly represented. This is because the Factories Act registration begins at 20 workers. If you have lower than 20 workers, you don't have to register. And women are also, until very recently, not allowed to work in carpet manufacturing in Uttar Pradesh. And that, as a result, obviously, there are other factors that dominate this as well, but legal changes are definitely one part of the puzzle here as well. Where women were not allowed to work, but women workers were desirable as workers in this situation. So women workers simply instead shifted to informal employment, therefore poorer working conditions, poorer health outcomes, and all those other things that we worry about with informality. The solution here is simple. Laws that are applicable to workers in India today try to essentially customize the entire working experience for workers in India. This is simply not working because to customize a working experience for workers, you have to presume needs. And needs are not uniform. Not only are governments often entirely mistaken in what women's needs are with respect to particular jobs, in many cases, it's simply not possible for you to come up with a general rule of what is desirable in the first place. And the correct thing to do here is to make reforms in all the existing regulations that affect women's ability to work in certain jobs or work in certain circumstances, for example, working at night, that allow women to make the choices that they consider most beneficial to them, right? In this context, another thing to understand here, by the way, is that we often have this conversation about formality as if there's a complete congruence between formality and welfare. We assume that if there's formality, greater welfare will automatically follow. But given the manner in which Indian firms have evolved, particularly given Indian regulations, this is not always the case. Just to give you one example, in 2014, there was a study done of textile workers in Tirupur, Tamil Nadu. This is one of the biggest textile hubs in India, has a majority of the most productive textile workers in India. And the researchers surveyed not only workers in the larger firms, but also the smaller firms. And in the smaller firms, it's not just that they are stuck with informal jobs in smaller firms. The workers have actively chosen to stay away from larger firms that offer formal employment and instead chosen to stay in informal employment for the simple reason that they have better quality of work experience in informal firms. For example, they don't have to show up at 8 a.m. every single day. If they come up at 9 or 9:30, that's allowed. Similarly, if they were to take a longer break than necessary, like for example, the usual complaints that we hear with things like Amazon, that I was supposed to take a 10-minute break and at the 12th minute I was scolded for taking a 2-minute extra break. Like that's not the kind of thing that happens in smaller firms. And so workers are looking at employment as a bundle of circumstances, as a bundle of features features of their life, because that's the work is what they're orienting their entire life around. And in this case, at least, workers have chosen to work in informal firms because they are able to offer that better customization. Now, in turn, firms choose to stay informal because the laws do not allow them to offer this kind of freedom to workers while also having the formal registration. And so the firms that made the strategic choice to stay informal, attract the best workers, give them the freedom, and the compromise between the workers and the employers is the employer will give you the freedom to structure your day-to-day life in a way that you see fit. We'll pay you on piece rate, so therefore you're paid entirely on productivity. And then finally, when there's a big order that comes in, you are expected to put in long nights multiple times, right? Multiple times to be able to meet those orders. And that's a compromise that everybody is very happy with. If we were to look at it from a far distance, we might say these workers are informal and therefore likely to have worse circumstances. But these workers are able to maximize their earnings, post about the number of clothes they're able to churn out every single week. And these increases earnings have actual impact on their health outcomes. They're able to access better health facilities. They're able to access better accommodation. They're able to access more social facilities outside work as well. So this not only safety and health, but welfare also increases in this particular context. Now, this is obviously not to say that informal firms generally for any industries are better, or formal firms in generally for industries are better. The simple point is, given the regulations that we have today governing firms, it is not a straightforward matter for us to say that formal firms will always offer better employment, or at least employment that offers better working opportunities or better outcomes for women workers. So broadly, occupational health safety regulations that apply to women workers are things that try to customize women workers' experience to an extent that simply is either too costly or too operationally difficult for employers to meet, and therefore is restricting women workers' entry into these workplaces in general. Another thing to remember about this is that it also affects promotion opportunities. For example, to take the semiconductor manufacturing example, if you enter as a woman worker at 22 and you want to be able to make 4 men someday in that factory, the person who's managing the entire factory floor, you need to be able to understand how the semiconductor electroplating function works, because you may have to advise another worker 10 years from now. But if I'm not allowed to participate in that process in the first place, how will I ever become foreman in the first place? So those are like structural issues given regulations that we simply haven't anticipated when we consider the legislators that are currently making these policies. And like this results in absurd situations. So for example, United Breweries, the biggest brewery in India, the director is a woman, but technically in many states in her own factory, she can't employ women workers because women are not allowed to work around those processes. And as a result, the proverbial glass ceiling that we often talk about, we want to break the glass ceiling, we want to be able to allow women in the workplace. The law prohibits you from breaking the proverbial glass ceiling in a certain way. And that becomes an absurd result of this. But beyond that, obviously, the organization also has a role. So for example, when it comes to constituting internal complaints committees, that's a big reason for women to not stay in the same workforce or even exit the workforce in some cases. They believe that if they're mistreated, they won't be given the proper remedy from either the authorities or from the government's end or from the organization's end. And it's simply a matter of enforcement. And it's also a matter of understanding where particular policies may be causing operational difficulties for firms or legal risks for firms that may be causing them to then not take up the issue of, for example, constituting internal complaints committees in the first place. But that is an area where greater enforcement from the government is the proper solution for ensuring more women's entry in the workforce. And then finally, beyond that, organizational measures that could encourage greater worker participation. As I said toward the beginning of this of my discussion, would not be uniform across all workers. For example, young women workers tend to prefer. I will actually clarify what I say when I say prefer. Tend to prefer working in larger factories where they offer worker housing. Now, when I say prefer, it's not really their preference, it's actually their family's preferences, because women often migrate like male workers for work in India. And when they're working in another place, parents are obviously worried for their safety, and they insist that women workers only go in places where there are worker hostels. This is obviously not an ideal solution. If we had a magic wand, we would like to be able to provide employment opportunities for women in a place where they are able to have full agency over their personal life as well as their professional life. But we also have to be practical about the realities as they exist today. For young women workers who are trying to put themselves through and educate through a degree, this worker housing might be an appropriate solution, even if it's not the best solution in principle. Similarly, for older women workers, they might want to be able to take longer breaks during lunchtime, for example, to be able to, let's say, go home and make lunch. Again, it's not for us to say it's one thing for us to say that women should not have to shoulder the extent of domestic responsibility that they're currently forced to shoulder in families. And that is certainly a problem that requires separate addressal, both on an economic and policy level, but also on a social level. But as things stand now, this is a real need that women have. And we need to be able to come with organizational flexible working opportunities, both at an organization level, but more importantly on a legal level, that allow these changes to come up in the first place and allow women workers to negotiate the working arrangements that are most beneficial to them. So that's about what I would like to summarize. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you, Abhishek. And good you flagged this small and medium enterprises, because that is what Poulomi Bhattacharya will like to focus, who has come with the NESCOM background. Poulomi, I will like you to focus on these SMEs where they can be key players for the gender equality, and also in a way empowering the women. Like Abhishek was flagging the thing of some special needs that women will need if to come in the workforce. But here I like to give an example that this menstrual leave is being talked about. I got it scuttled down when I was on chair, but it seems to have again raising the head, because definitely I will not like to have a junior who suddenly disappears on an important day when they have to deliver the goods. So these kind of an extra benefits, if you are asking, you are in a sense, it's self-harming or a self-goal. That is what you are working on. And definitely, Abhishek also flagged, and I also mentioned that skilling is very crucial for them to climb the ladder. You cannot be unskilled and expect to rise the ladder. So, how intermittent skilling can be provided to them for those who have show the interest or have the capability, so that they don't continue to be in the same workforce and go ahead with it. Over to you, Polan.
Thank you so much. I would like to begin the discussion with few data points, and there are so many contrary data points available with respect to the MSME sector, and I would like to begin with the positive side of it. So the data points which show that we really have reasons to be looking forward to the sector growing fast and women's participation within the MSME sector growing fast. So in the last decade, from a mere 2.5 lakhs, the women-led industries have grown to a number of 1.3 crores. So that's a substantial growth, and it's a promising picture. Even currently, 84% of the Startup India initiatives are led by women. 70% of the Mudra loans, which is the Government of India flagship initiative for providing loans to MSMEs, is granted to women-led enterprises. 47% of the overall valuation of the Mudra loans is for women. In terms of even after the Digital Public Infrastructure Jan Dhan Yojana, in terms of financial accounts and all, 56% is women-led. Now, these are a lot of positive points, which makes us feel that the outcomes will be positive. The overall participation percentage results will be promising. Also, if you look at the performance, so there are studies which say that in the women-led enterprises, the likelihood of women being hired is on the higher side, and the research states that 11% high likelihood as compared to men-led industries. Also, 1/3 of the woman workforce is women when it's a woman-led enterprise. Also, with respect to revenue generation, so there's a 12% increase in the monthly revenue generation for these women-led MSMEs, and 19% net income on a month-on-month basis. So this is, and again, in comparison to men-led enterprises, this is on the higher side. There's a 4% variation there. So all these pictures seemingly gives us an indication that the picture for women's participation in the MSME sector is very high. However, what we observe is the overall participation is only 20% as per official data. Even within that space, it's only 17% of the women-led MSMEs which actually end up hiring someone as an additional resource. And 95% of these which are hiring resources are not hiring more than 6 staff. So also the credit gap, if we look at the credit gap, it's 1.37 lakh crores, which is huge. Now, despite all the policy measures, despite all the performance statistics, why is there such a stark contrast between the actual scenario, actual participation, actual growth, scalability, viability, and all of that? So when we look at it little deeply, we realize that women enter, so even in micro, small, medium, the MSME sector, the micro part of it, even within the micro part, annual turnover when it's less than 10 lakhs, we call them nano rural women entrepreneurs. That's the term we use in the social sector. Now, with this scale of operations, less than 10 lakh. In fact, when we work, NASCOM Foundation works in the rural areas, what we have observed is majority of them are even below 3 lakh annual turnover. With these kind of enterprises, what are the kinds of policy pushes these kind of interventions require for even for instance Mudra? Now, the 30,000 that the loan is providing, the ticket size, maybe that needs to be increased. Maybe the timeliness of the loan needs to be increased. The paperwork that is, required to get this, fetch these documentation required. Not just this scheme. There are 10 other schemes which are, incentivizing women, having a preferential this thing for women. But despite that, when it comes to accessing these schemes, there are a lot of challenges that women face. However, if we do a very comparative this thing between private support, private sector support, private sector policy push towards emphasizing the private sector in boosting this growth and policy push towards government, we've observed that there has been a lot of policy measures that the government has undertaken. But when it comes to private sector, it's actually working in the reverse direction. So in multiple ways, the investment framework that needs to be really revisited. There is either some of the firms are doing it in a gender agnostic manner, or it's disproportionately tilted, inclined towards providing support to the men-led enterprises. There are discrimination at the from every level, like when you are applying for the loan to when the processes involved, the documentation involved. Collateral, of course, has always been a challenge for women. Woman ownership of the assets those being on her name has been a challenge. So none of these have been reformed when it comes to venture capital funding or any kind of private funding. That is a major challenge. Most of the men-led enterprises, if you see the percentage, how much they're drawing from the Mudra loan or the government-supported schemes, and the percentage of money that they're drawing from the private sector, there is, of course, the tilt is very clear. Now, apart from the credit gap, the other aspects, which is the training, and it's again and again we have realized that it's not a one-time training that's going to help anyone. Be it a training in the RCT, be it a skill-related training, be it a financial literacy-related training, and in the coming times, it's all the more important that we do club financial literacy with digital literacy. Digital literacy from a marketing point of view, very customized, training programs, not like general digital literacy, which is applicable for youth, school goers, women entrepreneurs, the profile that we're talking about, semi-literate, illiterate, who have never, this like last 2-3 years, they have tried doing something of their own. Otherwise, their entire background, the way they perceive themselves, the way the community has perceived themselves over the years is very different. So we cannot be talking to them in the same language, using the same pedagogy, use the same kind of modules for training them, or for that matter, even that one-time thing, because they at that point of time, they're not just learning, they are taking care of domestic responsibilities, care responsibilities. So it's not like you teach them for once and then expect that they will be able to perform based on that training. So customization is required. Phased manner training is very much required. Also, the entire process of the training, it's not like a grand infrastructure wherein you have to travel for, say, 3 hours, 2 hours on a daily basis to attend the training. Proximity to her neighborhoods, the training happening in a place which is easily accessible to her, which she can commute to on a day-to-day basis without much of a hassle. The attitude of the trainer, if she's penalized for bringing her child along or for being 5 minutes late, the group that we're talking about will really take to these kind of offense to these kind of. So basically, we really need to be gender sensitive in the way we are approaching them, right from mobilization to the training. Also, from a technical point of view, is skilling enough for an entrepreneur to really, grow? Is skilling of any kind, even if we're talking about all kinds of skilling, financial literacy, craft related skilling, digital literacy related skilling. But For entrepreneurship, we all know that one-to-one mentoring is a must, and not a one-time mentoring, a continuous ongoing mentoring in a phased manner. At every juncture in her entrepreneurial journey, she needs a different kind of support. She needs a different kind of mentor, different kind of mentoring, not necessarily a different kind of mentor. So that ongoing thing is very, very critical in her journey. Peer-to-peer learning, which is completely missing. So she can only access those 5 women who are, in her close proximity, in her hamlet, in her neighborhood. Digital literacy can really open the avenues for that if she is part of a platform, when she gets access to interact with more women of her kinds from different remote districts and villages of the country, then perhaps that will be really boosting her self-confidence, self-esteem, and the motivation for her to do similar stuff. Also, apart from this networking and peer learning, networking with the other ecosystem players. So see, she doesn't have time to invest in this. She doesn't have that much capacity to navigate through the physical spaces. But I think online spaces can really create a different space for her to interact with various things. So maybe the digital literacy component has to be looked at it from that lens, which is not just about Facebook account and WhatsApp account, but also a bit more than that, which is helping her navigate the challenges that she has been facing all this while in the in operating through the physical spaces. That doesn't mean that the responsibility for making the physical spaces safe goes away from the government or from anyone. Of course, better lighting, safety, transport, everything needs to be taken care of. But at the same time, online spaces have to be opened up for her, have to be made accessible to her, and also those spaces also have to be made equally safe. So that's why cyber security practices, both in terms of financial fraudulence as well as with respect to gender aspect, has to be taught alongside the skills. How to open an account, but also how to privacy policy, data protection policy, all that has to be really mentioned to her, but not in a very technical language. The way you will talk to a 18-year old girl who has done a formal education, that cannot be the same language. The skilling cannot be of the same kind for a woman who has never been to school, is 45 and has been managing a family all her life. It's just 1-2 year back when somebody came to a village and she opened an SHG, she became part of an SHG, and she's very recently started an initiative. She will not understand that same language. So that is something that needs to be really taken care of, in a very on a very serious note. And the private sector definitely has to, because these are like steps towards her capacity building. But despite all the capacity building initiatives towards her, the financial gap, and that has come up as a major gap when it comes to scaling up initiatives. So there are a segment of women who are at entry level, who are struggling to sustain their initiatives. These are like the nature of the many of these entrepreneurs, these businesses, is subsistence. They're not entrepreneurs of choice. But then there is another segment which has overcome these barriers, and now they're in the space of scaling up their initiatives, scaling up their enterprises, and they're really looking forward to easy quality money, which bestows trust upon them, which doesn't, which takes care of their limitations, their strengths. The idea behind putting in that kind of money is to see their ventures grow, and not just, you cannot look at it from a gender agnostic lens. And if you continue to do that, even if you're not discriminatory, I think that won't work. So that is something that really needs to be taken care of. And if all these things are taken care of, I do see that the MSME segments can really be the solution to increasing women's participation in the formal workforce, both ways, from a entrepreneurship lens and also from a woman, being employed by these women-led enterprises, both ways. Yeah. Did I miss out on the other question? I don't know. Sorry. Aruna, you're on mute.
You have covered the skilling, which was very, very crucial, and we wanted you to mention how to go about it. And gender equality, you did talk about. And in the process, you did touch that how they get empowered when they graduate from subsistence to sustainable level of businesses while they are going. So I think you have covered everything. Thank you so much, Pulami. Thanks a lot. Now that, she has talked about the digital gap, and she has talked about the credit gap, and she has talked about the various kind of incentives that are needed. There is another gap which is being talked about in some of the sectors, which is the wage gap. So I will ask Aishani Rai to sort of work upon it and what steps can be taken to cover those wage gaps. Because generally, in the informal sector, it is related to the outcome or the products that they make. So in the sense, depending on the speed and the skill and everything, the people can earn more. But then there are places where, the benchmark itself is at a very low level. So how that can be equated and what could be the policies and programs? And definitely, you being the last speaker in the panel, we will also like you to touch upon the way forward, where we are talking of the corrections in the policies or correction in the business attitude as we move ahead. Over to you, Raj.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. And first of all, extremely glad to be a part of today's discussion. So I think before we dive into, understanding what is the significant wage gap that does exist in the formal sector, I think my co-panelists have done a great job in just setting up the pace of, in terms of laying out what the gender disparity really looks like. But I think, as we just to highlight and probably reiterate some of the statistics, what we do need to acknowledge is that when we look at India, there is a significant low level of female workforce participation. Right? There is a 40% gap which we cannot negate or neglect. When we also look at income generation, there is only 18% of income that is being generated or contributed by this particular workforce. Now, what we kind of need to acknowledge is that the pandemic, like, though there has been a significant amount of effort where there have been a lot of legacy and legal and policy efforts to reduce this gender wage gap that we're talking about, what ideally has or what essentially has happened over the past 4-5 years is that we've seen the onset of the pandemic, which has kind of exacerbated some of these inequalities that already has that were in play, and has significantly decelerated some of these efforts to close the gender pay gap, right? And the formal sector is definitely no exception to this. Now, there are several ways of measuring this impact or to figure out, or to understand better whether women have been impacted or not, which really then helps us to understand whether their wage or a pay gap or whether there exists a pay gap. And I think, to my mind, two main measures come. One is that post the pandemic, or during the pandemic, who lost more jobs, and secondly, when we're looking at post the pandemic, who took more time to recover. And I think the answer to both of this lies in the fact that the female workforce did in fact they bore the brunt of the pandemic much more than, say, their male counterparts. Now, what really happened during this time is that we saw that there was an increase of unpaid household work, and women often find it difficult to struggle for time between their household and caregiving responsibilities, and this kind of leads to them giving a lesser amount of time dedicated. So this could be one of the reasons as to why we also do witness a justification for the pay gap that does exist from the company's perspective. Now, if I were to specifically answer your question as to which particular sectors I think took the hit, I think in my mind it's the tech, healthcare, and the finance sector, where there were noted differentiations in the pay gap. For instance, I think in technology, women do still earn 29%, much more lesser than men. And what we do notice is that as women climb up the ladder, or as we move up towards senior management, the pay gap increases, right? And what tends to happen in these two, like what starts off as a pay gap then results in two other outcomes, right? One is that your salary growth in general is affected, and secondly, also your career advancement opportunities are affected. Now, what happens in the salaried and corporate class is that this in turn has an impact on financial stability and economic independence of women. So this goes to say that the pay gap is not something that is only restricted to certain sectors of the formal economy, but it's across salaried employees and corporate sectors, and no woman is not affected by such a pay gap. Now, what to answer your other part of the question, which is that who are the primary stakeholders who can actually really like push the needle, or like what would be the way forward? I think to my mind, it's fairly simple. One is that you have the state and you have businesses, right? To me, these are the two most key stakeholders. Apart from that, you do have roles which you can allocate for civil society. But first and foremost, let's look at what the state can do. Now, there are a couple of efforts that the state and businesses can do together, but in my mind broadly, I usually tend to bucket it in two ways: the state's duty to protect, and secondly, the business responsibility to respect. Now, this is a very broad framing that I have personally borrowed from the United Nations Guiding Principles, wherein they have that protect, respect, remedy framework. And this is the framing that they adopt when they speak about human rights. To my mind, this is something that is not completely, absurd, and it is definitely something that can be incorporated when you're thinking about what are the roles that these various actors play, right? So, to me, the first and foremost role I think that the state can play is that investing in significant amount of research that really helps make the business case for that pushes businesses in investing in efforts to reduce the gender gap. Right now, what is, I think, critically absent in this particular sector is that, I think, as one of my co-panelists did very rightly mention, that there is a significant cost in some of these policies that legislatures expect businesses to follow. So it's important for states to understand this, and also important for them to flip the narrative where they make businesses understand what the incentives or the underlying benefits are in enforcing these gender inclusive policies. And to me, I think the biggest deterrent is that there is a lack of incentive which has been highlighted to businesses in investing in inclusive policies and programs. Now, that's the biggest or the broadest role that the state can really uptake. The second role, when we speak about businesses, I think policy and protocol to me forms the bedrock of solving most of these gender pay disparities. When we look at policy, I think it's policy to protect employees that face discrimination, in a sense, creating frameworks of accountability. And then the second is you have processes that facilitate inclusivity, right? I think the key problem that does exist in many of these corporate and formal sectors is that there is a trust deficit. So businesses should constantly work towards resolving issues that arise from this trust deficit. I think one of the best examples, and I think the most common example that comes to our mind, is the work from home policy, whether, it being the most gender inclusive policy. We did conduct at APTI, we did conduct a survey, a research way back post the pandemic. And what we did realize is that while across informal and gig sectors, women were less amenable to such policies, women in the formal sector express greater amenability towards such policy. And what we also did notice is that the number of women participating in formal workforces is much more lesser. So if you add two and two together, or if you correlate the two, I think definitely a policy as simple as a work from home policy can really increase the number of women participating in the formal sector. But all in all, when we're looking at the impact of gender inclusive policies, and if you're trying to understand how whether these gender inclusive policies work or they don't work, I think there is a two-pronged approach of working on this, or like measuring the impact from the business perspective. I think businesses need to really measure the impact of such policies, one at the individual level, and second at the organizational level. And why I think both is important is that when we speak of measuring impact at the individual level, when we speak about inclusivity, all of these are extremely subjective feelings and differ from person to person. So it's important for businesses to really assess whether they've done a good job or not at an individual level, to figure out whether women are actually feeling that their workplaces are inclusive. And secondly, at the organizational level. Now, it's important to also measure the impact at the organizational level, because then that can become your only incentive to further, investing in such gender inclusive policies. Because if businesses don't see a return in terms of enhanced performance, enhanced productivity, there is a likelihood that this is going to be only a 2-year stint. And beyond that, they're just not going to, continue providing such inclusive services or inclusive policies, right? Now, I won't get into the methods because I think that's fairly simple, which is there are several ways of measuring the impact. You have employee satisfaction surveys, you have diversion and inclusion metrics, there is training, retention rates. So there are a couple of ways of really measuring the impact. But broadly, I think the impact should be measured in this particular manner. When we look at, and I think, sorry for going back into the whole, what is the role of states and businesses, but I would really like to dial down on that as well, because I think that really answers your question on what exactly is the way forward if you're looking at sustained and long-term, goals. I think it's really important to break down what the vision actually is. And the vision is fairly simple, which is creating equitable workspaces. So if we were to look again at state and policymakers, I think first and foremost, apart from creating incentives, I think that is something that the state definitely should do, which is figuring out what the incentives really look like for businesses. I think the second most important role for states is to really explore newer ways of policy making. And why I say this is that it's important for them to explore more consultative participatory, which currently to some extent they're doing, but also much more bottom up. And by bottom up, I mean reaching out to your target stakeholder groups. So if women are the forefront of your legislation, then I think it's important for them to have a seat at the table, right? So that's what I mean when we speak about bottom up approaches of policy making. And I think, just to give you an example, I think currently it's been around in the news for some time now that the Labour Department of Karnataka is now in the midst of deliberating their menstrual leave. And what we do see is that they have a committee which is set up, but the committee is not something which is restricted only to business and state representatives, but they've also had a fair bunch of representation from academia, from civil society, from medical practitioners, all stakeholders who likely can have a role at making the right decision, right? Apart from this, I think when we look at specific policy interventions, it's also important to create frameworks of accountability. And I think my co-panelists previously have given a plethora of examples of how you can create these frameworks of accountability. I could just give you another example, and these could be starting measures when we're specifically looking at solving the gender pay gap, right? So I think Denmark, UK, and Sweden, they have gone at least they've done the first step in ensuring that the gender pay gap problem is resolved to at least a certain extent. And that's by creating a framework of accountability through transparency. So right now, all companies across these three countries are supposed to make public what their pay really looks like across various levels of seniority. And I think moving on to the role of businesses, I think first and foremost, businesses should stop following the one size fits all approach. Now, what I really mean by this is that I think and this is when they approach deciding norms and workplace culture, it's important for them to enhance the diversity of employees. And there is sufficient research which talks about there must be diversity of all kinds, which will be beneficial to businesses. But now coming to actually formulating the policies, how do they go about doing this? Now, as I think this has been discussed in the panel quite significantly, where we do see that do we make an exception or do we not make an exception? But I think it's not the question of making an exception. It should not be seen as a scenario where you're making an exception for certain types of employees. It's more about accommodating to the needs of the various employees that are present, which will benefit you in the long term. So I could give you a very quick example. For instance, research does indicate that women are likely to take more career breaks and dedicate fewer hours owing to their responsibilities. Now, this is a fact. So the bottom line solution is that you must create flexible working arrangement that accommodates such patterns and helps them re-enter the workforce. Now, for instance, if we were to look men or male workforces, what we do see is that married men tend to pursue a career break for educational pursuits, right? But on the other hand, women think twice to pursue higher education once they are married. So what really happens is that it's important to acknowledge that there are certain structural and societal barriers that impede women from even pursuing or advancing in their careers. So what can the company do then? So I think in this case, what should happen is that businesses can make active nudges and encourage their women employees to either, pursue higher education, Or if you're not able to do that, then you should provide capacity within the organization such that even if they're not able to, go for a higher education, which then leads to that wage gap that exists, you are solving for the problem right at the like at the root of it. So you are providing them capacity so that they can compete within the organization at the level playing field. What we also see is that underrepresentation of women in leadership roles, and I can say this having personal experience coming from an organization where it's a women led and a female majority employee workforce. I think there is a lot when women are up at those roles, you can really see where your career can really take you to. So what really happens is that a lack of such representation creates a perception that your effort is not really met with reward, right? So you need to take into, or you need to actively invest in measures to bridge the gap in both capacity and advancement, and thereby fix the narrative. So what essentially I think what I'm really getting at is that businesses must take up measures across the life cycle and must not look at fixing the pay gap in isolation, right? Merely making public that, oh, we're paying women and men the same amount is not the cause of the problem. Well, that to me is more the outcome. So gender pay gap is the outcome of the various other problems that really leads to the gender pay gap in the very first place. And most of this happens during the life cycle of women, in like during the life cycle of a working women, as soon as they enter their workforce, right from recruitment to retention to advancement and representation at all levels during the work life journey of a woman. There are societal barriers which does not allow them to fulfill all of these parts completely to their optimal potential, which then leads to the pay gap. So it's important to not look at pay in isolation, fix all of these other procedures that lead to the gap, and then your outcome may not even be the outcome in the very first place. Like your gender pay gap may not end up being an issue if you are able to fix all of the other issues in the pipeline.
Thank you so much for vast coverage. I think we have time for quick 1 or 2 questions. Tasmita?
Yes, ma'am.
So if there are any, we can go ahead with it. Don't see even in the chat box. So I think I will thank the panelists who extensively covered in a short span the wide range. And one thing that is coming very clear, that even though India has made a progress and we have reached 35%, but still a very, very long way to go if you look at the workforce. And definitely there has been some questions on the statistics of this sudden jump from 23 to 24, that the household work was suddenly counted as women being employed. That cannot be done, because a workforce means something you're earning while you are doing it. So that is very important. So that cannot be done, and we cannot camouflage the numbers. It is very important to get to the real numbers. So we are still ranging between 28 to around 25 to 28%, and still a very long way to go. And that is where we will have to catch up with the workforce. Yes, they progress on equity, they progress on their merit, they progress on delivery, but there are special needs. And that special needs and conducive environment has to be provided by the companies, by the policy makers, and by the society if we want more and more participation. So I think I thank all my 3 panelists, Abhishek, Poulami, and Ashani, who have done wonderful research. And I wish them to continue with their research and come up with more and more narratives, which can be a great input to not just the cuts, but also in the policy making and the company's way of thinking when they are moving ahead. So thank you so much on that. Over to you, Tasmita.
I see Sanchita ma'am has raised her hand.
Yeah, Sanchita, please.
Ma'am, sorry to say you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, maybe this can be addressed by the next panelist or this panel. Also wanted to kind of discuss, we discussed a lot about skill development and the kind of skill development that should take place. My question is, who should be involved in skill development? Is it like primarily the government's job, or the employers, or the industry associations, or say think tanks like CUTS? What is the optimum way? Because, we've also found out that a lot of the skill development initiatives have not been effective for various reasons. I'm not going into that. So if this can be addressed by this panelist or next.
Surely, surely. So we will make a beginning and the next panel can take over from there. One thing is very, very clear. It has to be by the company who employs or by the sector who are employing, because they know exactly the gap in the skilling and appropriately can add on to the skilling. There could be a policy, government incentives can be provided to bear that cost or some percentage of the cost that can be done up. The entry level skilling, okay, the government institutes are there, or other skilling institutes are there, which are less effective. In fact, the talk is to attach them to the MSMEs or SMEs so that, they get better skilled so that it becomes like an assured employment to them for an year. And the MSME or SME is also supported by getting one hand, sort of one person at zero cost. So that kind of a combination is being talked about, but then let's see how it progresses. But yes, to answer quickly is that it has to be the responsibility of the employer add on to the skills, and that can be provided, and who do not fit anywhere. Right. So that can be given by the organizational like CUTS and other things who can step in. Like I can give you an example, the new modern tools that has come up in the construction, or the new way of construction, that is the precast that has come up. Like some of the examples, the agriculture way that it is going. So that skills can be easily imparted to them who can take a loan to acquire those tools, or who can hire those tools and improve their productivity and the way it goes ahead. So it's a win-win situation for all. So I think I'll stop here, and we are quite on time. So over to the next panel.
Thank you, Aruna ma'am, as well as to all the speakers for such an insightful and detailed discussion. We have taken a note of all the important pointers which have been discussed here for our future studies. Now I would request Shri Dida Singh ji to kindly take forward the event and start with the second session. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, hi, this is Didar Singh here, and wanting to talk about skilling in a slightly different, more detailed manner. We're going to talk about skills, and we're going to talk about security. These two, we've already heard the first panel. They've given you a whole list of ideas about skilling in India in general and about India's economy, and particularly about women's participation in that economy. Everybody knows that is very important. Now the question is, let's hear what Mukta or Yamini and Tanya have to say about the actual skilling that is required in this context of this. So I'll request the panelists now to take over and give their views on this entire idea of women's participation in the workforce in India. Thank you very much.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to begin with, I would request all the panelists as well as Dida Singh ji to kindly switch on your cameras if possible to make this session much more engaging to us.
Sure, it's not happening. I don't know why.
Okay, sir.
Can I start now?
Sure, ma'am.
So first of all, I think before we actually come to the topic of this session, that is for an organized sector, but what question has, a big question which has arisen out of the first, this session about skilling. So it's very rightly said that, skilling, what skilling is being done is not working. The one reason where I worked in skilling, skilling for more than 4, 5, 6 years. So the skill gap analysis is required. What skill is required in industry is skilling is not imparted. So there is a gap. On the one side, industry is struggling with the skilled labor or skilled employees. On the other hand, there are certain skilled persons who are not getting jobs. So that, skill gap analysis is required. Although the National Skill Development Corporation, they did it, but I don't know how far it has been taken forward for skilling in the skilling gap. So that is foremost required. And as rightly said, that skilling, reskilling, and unskilling, of course, unskilling is also required. When the employees or the workers, they have been working through a certain set of skill set, they are not able to, unlearn that and learn the new one. So that process is also required. And the third thing in skilling is that in our country, the skilling has been taken as not as an education part of education, or you can say a degree or academics or something like that. The skilling concept per se has been taken from the Switzerland model or the Germany model, where there the skilling is done with the education, like there the person who is taking up skilling during the daytime, they do the skilling training, hands-on training, and skilling everything. In the evening shifts, they are studying. So more or less, they are working for more than 12 hours, which is not done here. Like here, skilling is being imparted to dropouts, right? So the parents, they don't recognize skilling as a, academic or as a degree or something like that. So I think more work is required at the policy level for skilling. This is what I just wanted to answer. And now we come to
one question to you, Muktaji. Since you
Sir.
come from the UN system, the question was that how do the UN play a role in skilling women, and where do you find the gap in this whole business of gender, and how do you see it from the UN perspective?
As far as UN is concerned, I was coming to that, but because that, the skilling question came up in between, so I
Yes,
was
yes.
trying to answer that. I think we'll start our session now, which is more on the unorganized sector. So I think no need of, saying that in India, unorganized sector is much more vast than the organized sector. And it is very easy to, make policies, make programs, make schemes, implementing them, monitoring them in the organized sector, but very difficult in unorganized sector. In total GDP of India, around 50% is contributed through the unorganized sector. And in this unorganized sector, in this contribution, again, around 40 to 50% is being contributed by women. Right. So, and basically these sectors are, as we all know, the construction sector and all those sectors where there is the agriculture sector, where no organized sector exists. So now, how far, first of all, the gender. When we talk of gender, then how far the role of these women in the unorganized sector is recognized as their livelihood, because if they are working because they are poor, right? In the infrastructure sector, or in the construction sector, or in the agriculture sector, if they are working as a labor, they are working because they are poor. They have to, procure food for their family. So the first thing is, gender does not matter here. Right? They have to work, whether it is he's a man or a woman, they have to work. So gender gap, as far as gender gap is concerned, getting the work, there is hardly any gender gap, 50% or 40-60%. But of course, there is a gap in the wage, which has to be looked into. Why there is a gap into the wage? Because again, that comes to the gender inequality. It is felt that since if she's a woman, she cannot do a hard work. And if a man can do a hard work, should be paid more. And if she's a woman, she has to take care of the child. And she will go for a longer, maybe lunch break or something. So all these gender taboos are why associated only to women. And then there are certain facilities which are required in the unorganized sector. Working women in the unorganized sector are still have a big question per se. Like if she has to deliver a child, no maternity leave. Whereas maternity leave is not the right of the women. Maternity leave is the right of the child. Right, but she is not provided. If she has to deliver a child, she has to go unpaid. If she has to feed a child, if she has to do the breastfeeding, although there are rules, there are policies, she should get breaks in between. But I don't know practically how far at these sites, construction sites, they are getting it. If she has to now, in the organized sector, it was talked about that Tamil Nadu and many other states now are working on the menstrual leave. When they get the menstruation, they will get leave. What about unorganized sector? They are physically the same, physiologically the same. So all these are, yaksh prashn, which we have to still, answer. As sir said, what UN Women now, I come to the question, the question that what UN Women is doing. UN Women is actually an organization. It's a new organization constituted in 2011. And through their work, they are implementing various programs which are aiming to empowering women in the informal sector. These programs focus on improving women's access to resources and enhancing their skills and promoting their rights in a small way. Like, when we talk of skill enhancement in the unorganized sector, then we cannot have a very big, skill program like NSDC has. We will have to have small skill programs. Now, those skill programs may not be, focusing only on livelihood skill program. This skill program may be enhancing their life skills, like how to take care of their health, how to take care of their, look after their safety and all. Now, there are projects like, the one project, I will just give you some examples. Like Second Chance Education Program is being run by UN Women. And in this program, those girls who could, due to their circumstances, could not complete their education, they are being, it is being tried that they are being taken back to the mainstream of education and mainstream of development. Similarly, for the gender budgeting and gender development, gender equality, there are certain programs for awareness generation on gender, skill development, capacity building of the community as well as officials for, narrowing the gap of this gender inequality are being implemented. And of course, at the policy level, also UN Women is working to pinch into, making the policy more gender sensitive, like gender budgeting, gender auditing. And from the safety point of view, now again, I come to a very big question that what about the safety of women? For organized sector, of course, there are acts like POSH takes, looks after the safety of women and, the harassment of women. Something happens, then there is an act in place, and they can take help of that act, go to the to the IC. Of course, for unorganized sector, there is within that act there is a provision of local complaint committee. But how far those committees are active? How far those committees people know about? How far those women who are working at the construction sites in the agriculture sector, if something happens to them, how far they know about it? So how far these acts which are well in place, but how far these are being implemented properly and people know about them? So that, safety again is a big question for women working in the unorganized sector. How far they are, they are facing the harassment by the contractors, by small people who are, giving them some little employment in the unorganized sector. So these are the questions we actually need to focus on when this project, progresses further. So, more focused now, what we feel like when we go to the field, and we really actually work with the community, there is gender gap is really making a painful situations for women, right? Since you are women, you have to, since she has children, she has to fill their mouth, she has to feed them, she has to tolerate all sorts of unsafe circumstances, all sorts of harassment because she has to earn for them. And recently, in our state, within, I think, last 20 days, 2 children from the construction sites were stolen. Right now, what is the safety? Right? Because that lady, she had to work, she was working, she was a laborer, she went to the work, and when she came back to where she left her child, literally on the site, in the corner of some site, her child was stolen. What is the safety? Then what is her safety? What we talk about, the crutches at this construction site, how far those are implemented. So when we talk in such gatherings, we should try to take these policies, these programs at the ground level. So what I request to the organizers or the cuts, that if they take forward this project, they should at least do an audit, right? An audit of how far these policies and programs have been effective, have given something or some output or outcome to the beneficiaries. I don't say beneficiaries, they are the claim holders. They are also, citizens of India. So that's all. Thank you so much.
बहुत बढ़िया, Mukta ji, thank you very much for your inputs. Now, my basic question to you, and actually to Yamini ji, who's the next person to speak. Yamini ji, what do you think about what Abhishek said a little earlier in the day? He said that informal sector is better than the formal sector for the real employment and for all the benefits that come with it. And the on-ground situation is that people prefer the informal sector in the SMEs. Now, how do you counter that question? How do you answer that? Thank you, Ji. Yes, Yamini.
Sure, thank you. Just stepping back a little bit, I think we are trying to choose between two slightly unfavorable situations and trying to see what's the better situation one would choose. So I think the whole question of choice and saying one sector is better than the other, it becomes a bit of an exercise in relativism. And I think for policy, we need to believe in something that's good and that's decent, and there's focus a little more on the questions of quality. So I would sort of say, if you want me to agree or disagree, I'd say I would probably disagree, but I think the terms of the agreement or disagreement are themselves a bit flawed. That would be the first response. But I think stepping back, just synthesizing some of the excellent points that different panelists have made about the informal sector, let's just sort of see what that looks like, right? India's informal sector is 88 to 90% of the workforce, somewhere between that, and different estimates put it at different levels. Now, the global sort of benchmark is around 60%. So we are not like so poorly off, right? There is a bit of an additional gap. The challenges come in when we start looking at the details. One is, where is this, additional sort of informality sort of focus coming in? Where is it coming from? Why does it persist? And B, who's bearing the disproportionate sort of costs of that, right? And somewhere at a very global level and at a historic level, we have to look at, do our growth models, economic growth models, support quality engagement with labor markets? I think different economists will give you very different pictures. So without getting into a very academic debate, I think this is a question for us to sort of relook at now that we have the next few years to sort of, see if there can be virtuous cycles that can be set in motion. I think just very basically, the informal sector is no picnic. I think, there are no contracts, there's daily wage work. Technology is not necessarily a big, tool in the hands of informal workers to help better their working conditions. Social security is low. I think all of the panelists have talked about the health hazards, occupational hazards, many challenges that come with working in the informal sector. But at the same time, I think one of the biggest issues is the absence of a formal workplace, right? And so in majority of the case of informal work, it's happening either when it comes to women, either at the home, because much of women's work, informal work, is carried out in home-based work. or it is out in agriculture in the fields. And while some laws do apply, I think the POSH Act is one of the better ones that actually applies regardless of the nature and form of the workplace. Several of the laws that many panelists talked about are, they're applicable to about 4 to 5% of the sector. So having that kind of a mismatch in where policy attention lies disproportionately and where the workforce lies disproportionately are, I think, to me, one of the biggest challenges of why informal sector continues like this. I'm looking up your name. So Paulomi laid out a really beautiful sort of picture of, to me, also the specificity to which we need to get to when we talk about employment and labor markets, right? And in the informal sector. So that term now covers everything from home-based work, piece rate work, to some form of gig work, to small scale enterprise work. I think this whole nano or sub nano, I think we're all trying to find the right language for understanding very, very small, and they're not enterprise activity, but self-employment or own account activity, which are very, very ticket sizes are really small. The investments are really small. And I think when we say really small, it's even like 20,000 rupees, right? We don't even have a category for this. So I think that whole, one is that whole informal work spectrum has to really be broken down, because it covers everything from businesses to piece rate to, we are in this, we are also in a narrative shifting moment in our country's history, where we are seeing, a shift from workers to self-employed, right? So I think the gig worker is a very, very interesting sort of example for that. So on the one hand, one can say these are, platform workers with no there is an aggregation that's happening at a platform level of demand, and you're trying to channel supply, and there is a some modicum of, work activity happening and recompensation happening with some benchmarks and so on. On the other hand, I think the virtuous narrative of this is, look, these are all self-employed jugaad workers. They are enjoying this. If they don't want to work today, they don't need to work. So I think this whole slightly distorted narrative is something that we really need to get ahead of. We don't want a victim narrative. We also don't want a hyperbolized narrative that today is this laissez-faire economy where anyone can engage with the economy in any way and opt in and out of systems. It's not like that. There is a structural sort of issue when it comes to why our informal sector is so disproportionately huge in the country, and also why women continue to be there. And I think the panelists talked about how men are also in the informal sector. So I think getting into some of these details becomes very, very critical. Now, having said that, I think this question of which sectors is important to get into. So agriculture and allied, like forestry, all of those are the largest share of the informal sector. Then you have, of course, trade, construction. And when you start to look at each of these, I think the nature of work is very different. So a lot of the questions that preceded in terms of wage gaps, quality of employment, we have to take a very sector-specific approach. Otherwise, we are talking in very abstract terms, and then our solution thinking also remains abstract. So we have everything from on the table, from flexible work to maternity leave to sexual harassment to what have you. But actually, at the end of the day, one needs to get specific about what's possible and feasible within sectors. What are the current benchmarks and where do we want to get to? And I think, Mr. Singh, this question of the MSME sector is the most critical. And this is where I think, like, the SME, the micro is like the disproportionate share is in the micro sector, right? What we are talking about in terms of policy solutions like PLI, productivity-linked incentives, all of these things are not at all, affecting these 1 to 2 to 3 sized enterprises where majority of women work. So I think for me, one of the biggest gaps in the undesirability of some of where, these trends is that we need a very radical paradigm shift in thinking about the MSME sector itself. I agree that that is the engine of growth, that is the engine of employment. It is where one should work. And some of the panelists, Abhishek, Poulomi, all made really important points in terms of the low margins that exist in these small enterprises. And so expecting them to then take on large cost or big ticket worker welfare, sort of initiatives is a big gap. And so, but that doesn't mean that we say maternity leave is not important. We cannot say those things, right? We cannot say, so, okay, don't pay social security. You don't have the margins, like you're off the hook. I don't think that that's the solution we are looking for. I think we're looking for where policy can actually come into solving for these problems and lining up the right incentive structures for small enterprises, for less than small enterprises, as well as medium enterprises, to actually be able to meet the challenge of ensuring a productive workforce and a productivity measured in multiple ways. It's not just that how many things did I assemble today. It's also, am I absent? I think Mukta talked about some of the questions of absenteeism, etc., that are perceived of women. Now, to me, absenteeism is an outcome of, is a metric of productivity based on what the inputs are into the employment. So I think as we sort of start to look at the picture and stitch the picture like this, then the economy starts to look very different for me, and labor markets then, and solving for informality then becomes a very different question than just saying, okay, it's actually better to be there because you're more free. Anyway, the formal sector is so terrible. I don't agree with that. Now, the question of how do you translate, and there have been many interesting efforts to transfer or shift informal structures to formal work arrangements in small ways, right? I think one of the big questions is the labor code. Within the labor codes, unfortunately, when it comes to women, we are only thinking maternity. We don't even think of any other things. So I think that is one that we have to get over. I mean, men also become fathers. So let's not make maternity only a woman's problem and a woman's responsibility and a challenge that only employers that have women face. Let's make it everybody's problem by saying, look, where is the parental leave? Where is the paternal sort of responsibility in this? And that requires both, as someone said, a societal shift, but it also requires serious policy dialogue. I mean, there are countries where, like South Korea, that mandate parental leave and include paternity leave as part of that. So a man has to justify why he doesn't want to take parental leave, right? And so let's make this a norm that and make it a responsibility of both parents equally, where there are both parents present. I mean, there are obvious caveats to all of this, but I do think that if we make the maternity question a centerpiece of discussing women's work, then we end up sort of reinforcing and reifying some of these patriarchal sort of understandings of work and of women's work. Now,
thank you, Riji.
Yeah.
You reach your 8 minutes.
Okay, just one last point on this. I think there's also this question of one of the biggest findings that studies show in India is that mothers work, not in household work. Everyone does household work. Mothers actually go back to work, and those are the kinds of women that Mukta is talking about, which are the women who work out of need, or poor women, working class women. They all have always worked. So there are ways in which they find arrangements to actually get back to work because the economic need is greater. So I do think that this picture of these are some of the primary challenges. I think I was asked to speak about challenges in the informal sector, and I think the challenges are one around to me, the biggest challenge is around sensitizing the demand side of the question, which are the business side of it and the policy side of it, in a way that they have to be incentivized to solve for this rather than seeing this as a supply side problem. I think to me, this is one of the critical things that we need to look at. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yaminiji. Excellent points you made. And two of them that I find very, very of use to us is, number one, you talked about finding solutions industry-wise or sector-wise, rather than a general kind of response to each question. And the second thing that you are very good at, and you brought out very, very clearly, was that women are important as part of society, as part of the whole skilling program, where you have to somehow get it higher up, and policy plays a role in there. It's very important to understand where policy can actually work and be of some use. So Thaneja comes from the Vivagiri National Labour Institute, which is the main labor institute of the Department of Employment and Labour in India. And so let's hear from the government point of view. What do you think in response to what Yamini ji mentioned in terms of sectors and in terms of actual policy work that can be done to improve the lot of women, especially in the informal sector, and to ensure employment? Thank you, Ji. Right, Dhanaya ji.
Thank
Go
you
ahead.
so much. Very good afternoon. Very good afternoon to all of you. To begin with, as discussed by our previous speakers, the informal economy in India, it comprises a significant portion of the workforce, especially the women. They are the substantial part of this sector. So these women often face multiple barriers to formal employment, including this, as we already discussed, that the lack of education and the skills training and job opportunities. So, and at the same time, we should know that how it is perpetuating into this limited access to education and skill, and how it is perpetuating into poverty. That would be the first question I think we should look at. Like women, as for example, when we talk, women often engage in low wage and low productivity job and without education and skill training. And these jobs typically lack job security, benefit, and opportunities. And also it is automatically trapped into poverty. And without education and skill training, women are excluded from many economic opportunities. And also this vulnerability can lead to exploitation. And these informal sector women often have a little knowledge of their rights and other aspects from regarding the rights of various laws, and also it can lead to exploitation. And these women often have it may lead to the intergenerational poverty, the state transmitted from one generation to the other. So the lack of education and skill training for women affects their children, and it is like perpetuating a cycle of poverty. So the children of uneducated parents are less likely to access education, more likely to work in the informal sector themselves. So India has launched many schemes and initiatives to foster women's participation in the workforce, to promote gender equality. And when we start with we can say that the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, this is a campaign for gender equality. And then this Mahila Ihat, to provide an online marketing platforms for women entrepreneurs to showcase and sell their products. And also, and these kind of activities are leveraging the technology, and they are getting a kind of women entrepreneurship. And another notable aspect is Stand Up and Startup India, to promote entrepreneurship among women. And there are programs for informal sector workers, especially for informal sector workers, skill upgradation for choir industry, then trade-related entrepreneurship assistance and development by MSME Ministry, then of course National Rural Livelihood Mission, and to access the gainful self-employment and skilled wage employment opportunities. Then there are also PMKVY, to enable a large number of Indian youth to take up industry relevant skill training. Then digital Saksharatha Abhiyan, and again women entrepreneurship platform by Niti Aayog. It is providing an ecosystem for budding and existing women entrepreneurs across India, like incubation, and they are providing mentorship and funding support, and also providing the networking opportunities. There are many state government initiatives also, and these initiatives, among others, play a critical role in enhancing this socio-economic status of women in India by providing them the necessary skill and resources and support to participate effectively in the workforce. And before looking into this more initiatives, I think we have to look at the situation of women in particularly in India. really we have to look at who is this informal women and how can we make them to get out from their house. I think that's more important when we talk theoretically. There are two different spheres of women's work when we exclude formal sector women, those who are working in the formal sector. The first sphere where the women is restricted to the household and performing all the so-called duties and work within this confinement. And the second sphere, the women would already be engaged in wage labor in the informal economy or in agriculture, but without actually being recognized as a worker. So in this sphere, the women would be involved in various kinds of small-scale productive work and working either on piece rate payments or for the benefit of their family. Now, in the second sphere, when the woman is working in the informal economy, she often still works from home, remaining confined to a restrictive and casualizing sphere of the household. Overburdened with multiple tasks, and she now has to accomplish at home, and there is a risk of getting entrapped in this stage. And without interacting with the knowledge society, the home worker has no opportunity to enhance their capabilities, and therefore it is very essential to move on from this sphere that restricts women to this confinement of home and the strangulating boundaries of domesticity, and not treating the second sphere as the ideal condition of work. We can say that the second sphere does present a step forward, providing the women with at least a small income and therefore the chance to be recognized for the work she is doing. And this recognition and thereby the confidence that the women can gain from their work increases gradually. And hence, the integrating women into wage labor means enabling them to integrate with the outside world. We can say that the like knowledge society. And if a woman stays within this traditional confinements of the household, this interaction is not going to take place. So there is no chance then that she can, through interface with co-workers or other members of the society outside her family. And hence, when we think of the main initiatives to improve this access to education and skill training, I think community-based education programs may be a good initiative to start with, like establishing a community learning center that offers like literacy classes and vocational training and business skills can help the women to gain more skills and improve their income. And another example is National Rural Livelihood Mission and Kudumbashree program that is also promotes microfinance and business development models. So providing these micro loans to these programs and the business training to women that can enable them to start or expand small businesses, increasing their income. And we need to focus this initiative first, and then on all the other ecosystems while considering this changing world of work. That is, we have to focus much on the strategies to bridge the gender disparities in digital and future-oriented skill sets, and also focus on the skilling programs and how they can be integrated with the job platforms to provide better employment. Then when we look at the first point, like how we can bridging these gender disparities in digital and future-oriented skill sets. And we all know that we stand on the brink of a technological revolution, ensuring like equitable access in these domains in not only a matter of fairness, but a prerequisite for sustainable development and innovation. Then bridging these gender disparities is essential. The studies have consistently shown that the diverse teens are more creative and produce better outcomes. By
Ananji,
bridging this
close
gender
to
gaps,
close to 8 minutes. You need to
yes, I
close.
divide it. So,
Yeah,
yes, I
thank you.
divide it. So,
Sorry.
by bridging these gender gaps in these digital skills, we can harness the full potential of our workforce, and that will definitely lead to the development of any country. So, gender disparities in skill sets perpetuates broader social inequalities. When women and girls are denied the opportunity to develop digital and future-oriented skill, they are excluded from high-paying jobs and leadership roles in these sectors. And bridging these gaps is a step toward achieving a social equity and justice. So let me end up here. Thank you.
Yeah, and very, very important points you've raised, especially about the participation by the community in the whole plan, the whole programming, and the whole working of skilling actually is very, very important. So thank you very much for it. And may I now ask if there are any questions from the floor that we need to take up before we conclude this sessions here? Thank you. From the floor, do we have anything?
Sir, I guess we have two questions from Shweta in the chat box.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead with the question, please. What is the first question?
Yeah, so what Shweta says is that as part of a policy reform discussion, I would like to ask the panelists to share their views on the following. The first one is the age gap specified in the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2006, which sets the legal marriage age at 18 for women and 21 for men. Would adjusting this age disparity help improve the economic participation of Indian women? And the second question says, how can we safeguard our country from a potential population implosion similar to what Japan is experiencing while implementing these women empowerment policies?
Okay, Ji, thank you very much. Thank you. Would anybody like to respond, please?
Yes, I would like to respond on the question which has been raised on the age at marriage. You know, the Child Marriage Prohibition and Prevention Act 2006 was
Ji, boliye, boliye.
Was a result of a very long exercises and the experiences held in the country, because child marriages have been, rampant, and it was a social evil in our country. And why this 18 and 21 was, imposed was because, normally the girl is younger than the boy. So therefore, this 18 and 21 was established as, because 18 is the adult age, attaining the adulthood. So viewing that, and as per physiologically also, because 18 is appropriate for reproduction also, this age was imposed. Now the question comes that whether if this age is, will it help in improving the skill set or improving the livelihood or the economic empowerment of women? Yes, of course, because by the age of 18, if she continues with her studies, then she normally attains minimum 12, and that is appropriate to gain further skill, right? If she wants to go to ITI, Polytechnic, or something, formal education, or even in an informal education system, skill set, she can attain. She is matured enough to attain a set of skills. So that was the reason. So I think this age is appropriately done in this act. That's all.
Anji, any further? Anything further, Ji? Anything further?
I can add. This is Yamini. Sorry, I couldn't raise my hand in the chat for some reason. So I think two quick things, right? Like, I mean, there's no one solution to increasing the economic participation of women, Shweta. Age at marriage is a normative issue, and I think it has other ramifications. It has multiple ramifications. So, for example, age at marriage being fixed at a certain level, and then the social norm around marriage being important for girls, especially by a certain age. And this whole, the kind of tensions people have around sexual propriety and how long, having an unmarried girl at home, all of them kind of stack up, right? And the implications of that is that there are fewer investments made in girls. So I think we saw, for example, girls are even in rural continue to be sent to public schools, whereas for boys you switch to private schools. So I think starting with that, I think out-of-pocket expenditure on healthcare for girls versus boys, there is a gap. Now the immunization gap is closed. Gender gap is almost non-existent. But in the very recent past, we have seen that gap is huge. So I think there's multiple things that happen, that stack up. So I think age at marriage being a singular thing that can have a, some kind of stroke of pen change, I don't know. But for me, like the larger set of things are around these kinds of issues. So how do you shift norms around the value of girls and women, the value of investing in human capital, capabilities of girls, and therefore seeing, labor markets versus marriage markets in some ways are seen as juxtaposed, and sometimes marriage markets are mostly winning out and saying like this is where the girl is more appropriately channeled than a labor market. So I think some of these things we have to think through, and there's many other questions that are sub questions to this. I think this population explosion question, I'm not very sure, but I don't know that how relevant that is. Tasmita's, your point about transportation is really critical. I think it's very important to look at the mobility barrier. And you're seeing this in urban Delhi, right? Like Girija Borkar's study talks about the issue of girls choosing suboptimal or second, third choices in education. These are Delhi suburban young women where for education and avoiding colleges that they would otherwise have liked to have gone to. So I think the mobility issue, the commute issue, a lot of these are really critical. Sorry, I have my daughter's just home, but I'll stop there and hand over.
Thank you very much.
I would also like, I would further add that the age at marriage in the Child Marriage Act Prevention Act 2006 was not only for girls, but also, boys were also sufferers of child marriage. So therefore, this minimum age for boys is also been fixed. So we can't say that child marriage is, victimizes only girls. Of course, girls are more sufferers because their education and their development and everything is being stopped. But even boys, they were seen to be sufferers. So therefore, the age is restricted.
Any further questions?
Yeah. I couldn't hear anything. I think we're still.
Yeah, we were
Okay.
also wondering.
Okay. Mr. Didar Singh is saying that his volume has gone. Okay. Tasmita, I think we move on.
Yeah, so
to the
any
next.
further questions by any of the panelists, or if you would like to discuss anything else related to the matter or any views to be shared?
I'd like to, but I can wait if others do. I have like two very quick smaller points to add. So just so that we keep the conversation going. But okay, why don't I just take it because I don't want to waste more time, and then I'll stop in a couple of minutes. I think there's
Sure.
2-3 issues. One is as a sector level, I mean, as an industry level, and then the sector level. I think we have a far more focus on manufacturing in the discussion today than services. And I think services is a really critical piece. And Danya talked about digitally enabled work as well. And I think these are, while they might seem like very small scale right now, they are transforming the work landscape entirely. So if we don't get women ahead of this, whether from a skilling perspective or a demand side perspective or creating decent work lens, I think we are losing momentum in this. So I'd like to say that services sector is something we should take very, very seriously, and the digitally enabled work opportunities. And the second thing is also this whole question of mismatches. I think we are talking a lot about skilling, right? And the mismatch between what women are getting skilled for, which are very traditional sectors, and where the jobs are. And so they are getting over sort of channeled into beauty, food manufacturing, food processing, some of the very traditional sort of sectors that gender traditional sectors. So the whole like shift to non-traditional livelihoods is a very, very critical one to sort of put more weight and more momentum behind. But there is also other kinds of mismatches happening, and migration is the biggest sort of example of how economies and societies are coping, right? So you have a job getting created somewhere else, and you have a productive, a ready workforce elsewhere. So East India, South India are two very, very classic examples. So 40%, 50% of the factory work for women is in the South. And there is a saturation in terms of local worker availability. And so you are seeing that migration. And this is a good thing. I think migration is important, but we have to manage it well and actually have policies that are able to support young women in their mobility sort of mobility aspirations as well as possibilities of getting work. And by that, I don't just mean shelter. I think locking up young women in hostels is something we need to talk about. I think shelter is a very, very critical thing. But if that is coming with this tag of, then, okay, we lock them up in the evenings and that makes parents feel safe. We have to address this as both a policy issue as well as a larger behavior and normative change question, because it's less than ideal. We don't want young women in those situations. But having said that, there are many other things, right? Language is a big issue, food. So when you talk to again, going to the field is such an important thing, because you learn every day so many things. So the same Tirupur, I think Abhishek was talking about, women, they are aspirational, they have come, they have their phones, they're able to be in touch with their families. They're like, I can't read the sign, right? The sense of loss of agency, which I think somebody talked about earlier. I think a lot of these really need to be understood better, and sort of employers need to be supported in creating better and more enabling conditions for even migrant workers to come in. So Kerala is a good example of why, there are many, many reasons for this, but I think how they are able to manage in-migration from other states, support family migration. I think there are some good practices there and some lessons to be learned, because at the end of the day, it is both good for individuals, for young women, and it is good for the growth and GDP as well. So I think there are some ways that you can tie both of these objectives together. So I just wanted to make these 3-4 points. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for such good points. We have taken a note of it. Now, I would like to request Varidhi ma'am to please take this forward for a closing remark, if there is no further question. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Tasmita, and I would really like to, congratulate all the panelists and our esteemed moderators for such an engaging session. We came across really thought points where we need to work on, not just as a representative of civil society, but the citizens and the individual level. So I would completely agree to the recent point made by Yamini that a lot of sensitization is required at the employer level. And I completely agree to the points that we have come across really good suggestions how we can make the formal and the informal sector a better place to work for the women folks. I really, I heard a very nice sentence by Muktaji, and she said that maternity leave is not just for the women, it is the right of the child. So we really need to think on those lines, whenever we talk about the entitlements of women, it is not just taken in a very positive note, even in the formal sector and even in very good places. Those places, those are considered good to work for. So whenever a situation of, comes, whenever a lady or a woman needs to take care of leave, or for any kind of situation, it becomes a taboo. So I would really like to thank Dr. Aruna Sharma and Didar Singh ji and Yamini, Paulimi, Abhishek, Dhanya, Aishani, and I hope I'm not missing on anybody. And of course to Sanchita and Tasmita for a very nice and engaging session. Thank you so much. And we would like to continue this series of webinars on the issues of formal and informal workers. So, and we hope to see you in the next session, of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paulimi.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
everyone.
Abhishek. Thank you, Yamini. Yeah,
Bye.
thank you, Ashani. I think Ashani has left. Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.